this more widely once it starts. Okay. So are you all on the... I sent out a Google Doc link that what I'm going to do is that I have like an outline sort of pre-prepared. And this is how I like did lectures at camp, is that as we sort of like go through stuff, I'm going to sort of copy paste the stuff that's on my outline into the Google Doc. So you all should take notes like sort of independently on your own. And like the way you normally do for school, you should treat this like a school lecture. If for people who watch this video later, you should also similarly take notes the way you would for class. So that's all the procedurals. Feel free to like if y'all are mute to unmute yourself to just like ask me any question at any time. Like I'm happy to stop and pause to explain anything. A handful of times along the way, I will like sort of ask questions to you all to sort of like see if you can like understand the application of some of these particular concepts, and then we'll like move forward from there. And there's only like 4 of y'all, so we can probably keep this pretty orderly. Hey, does that sound good to everyone?
Yep.
Yeah. So I don't know how much ground I can realistically cover in just 1 hour, or at least the hour I'm setting aside here. I'm going to hopefully do a part 2 for this sort of lecture. My hope for part 1 of this is to introduce you all to here's what basic IR studies, and what are the 3 main schools of thought that have traditionally dominated IR. There are a couple other schools of thought / people who criticize the very idea of sort of analyzing everything from these different 3 schools. But this is sort of like the traditional, like if you take an IR class in college, this is what they will teach you. And I think that even if like the academic literature is starting to move away from like a pure dogmatic, realist, liberal, constructivist approach, still knowing these 3 approaches is still really useful for when you're reading IR literature and knowing like sort of a lot of the tacit assumptions that they're making, and sort of better analyzing the clash between different academic authors, because a lot of disagreement between IR scholars is usually predicated or is a symptom of disagreements between larger schools of thought. And having this background, I think, will help immensely for whenever you're doing IR research. For those of you going to the TOC in a few months, like I hope that this will be really useful for when doing like cutting cards. And for those of you like who aren't going but are still like competing next year, then I think this will be super useful for future seasons research and such. So my computer's being a little slow. So that's the top 10,000 feet level stuff of what we're doing. So the fundamental question we have to ask ourselves is, what is IR meant to study? And the answer is IR studies the ways in which states interact with each other. And it's primarily the basic unit, if we can call it that, in IR is what we call the Westphalian state. So I guess random history trivia question. Does anyone know what the Westphalian state refers to? If you took AP Euro and remember anything from it, you might know the answer to this. Okay, no one's got it. So you don't really need to know this.
Was it like some treaty that established sovereignty?
Yeah. So yeah, it was. I believe I think was written in 1648, from what I remember, though I could be wrong. Basically, yeah, it was a treaty that, for the sake of simplicity, more or less established in international law the idea of sovereignty. And so from what I recall, the Treaty of Westphalia came at the end of the 30 Years' War, which, if you remember from AP Euro, was like a religious war that was fought over the question of whether or not, between, I think, Protestants and Catholics. And the ultimate conclusion of that treaty was that the ruler of each region was allowed to decide for themselves what the religion of that particular sort of governing area was. And the idea that this establishes is that territories with states become sort of solitary units that decide for themselves how they will govern, and more importantly, how they will interact with other states. And the reason this becomes incredibly important is that the very notion that the international system is just a collection of different states who all autonomously interact with each other and usually seek their self-interest, it sort of shapes and is like the background for a lot of the IR schools that we're going to talk about. But like earlier, you don't really have to know what the Treaty of Westphalia is to understand IR theory. It's just a little bit of world history. So what IR is not is understanding or breaking down government structures. That's what we would call comparative political systems. My own IR professor made a pretty good analogy as to what the study of IR is. She analogized international relations to like a game of pool. What IR studies is how do the billiard balls on the pool table interact and collide with other billiard balls, but we don't particularly care what's inside the billiard balls. We just simply care about why they clash with each other and how and when and explaining what happens as a result of those clashes. And the last sort of general point before I think I get into the more specific details is the concept that IR is amoral. And this is a little weird concept for LD debate, which is ostensibly about morality. But what IR is that it's not necessarily prescriptive. It's just a system and a school of thought that's dedicated to explaining how states interact with each other. It can make prescriptions in the sense that some scholars think that state X should do Y because it's in state X's best interest to do so. But it doesn't really make any sort of moral, normative judgment the way like Kant or Util would. Although Kant's name is still going to be brought up because you can't avoid Kant in LD. Weirdly enough, I was talking to Bob Overing once, and he told me that people used to read realism as an LD framework, which struck me as really weird. And I'm about to get into realism, so I'll explain that to you. But that's the only time I think I've ever heard, and we've lost Ishan. That's the only time I've ever heard of one of these schools of thought being used as a LD framework. Okay, so that is the first part of it. Before I get into the first school of analysis, I have to introduce what are called levels of analysis. So, and I just pasted that into the Google Doc. So, IR is traditionally conducted from one of three levels of analysis. We call them, it's easy enough to remember, it's the first level, the second level, and the third level. The first level is what we would call the level of analysis. What this basically says is that if you are someone examining international affairs from the first level of analysis, what this means is that you analyze it from the perspective of individuals. How do the particular individual decision makers involved decide or explain why certain things happened in the international landscape? So, to give an example, if I were to try to explain let's say the war in Syria from a first level analysis, I would be focusing on the sort of top level decision makers and how they think and act in order to explain the Syrian civil war. So the top level actors maybe I shouldn't use that word, but the individual actors involved in the Syrian civil war. There's Bashar al-Assad, who is the president of the Syrian central government. There are a bunch of rebel groups. I don't really know any of their leaders. There's Russia, who's headed by President Putin. And then there's obviously like some U.S. interference, and we have Trump. What the first level of analysis would do is to analyze from the perspective of Assad, Putin, or Trump, and think about how do these specific personalities and leaders interact to create the situation in Syria. So, for example, from the first level of analysis, one way to explain the Syrian conflict is to say, or at least one aspect of the Syrian conflict is to say that let's take Russia and President Putin. Putin is someone who believes in sort of, if to take one account of his history, Putin is someone who wants to restore, quote, the like greater glory of Russia. He believes in asserting Russian hegemony against what he perceives as encroaching Western influence. He therefore sees influence in Syria as being key to secure Russian interests in the Middle Eastern area by guaranteeing Russia access to another warm water port. And as a result of his calculation, he decides that it's best for the Russians to support the Syrian government. That is an example of a first level analysis. I know that like I just introduced this idea to you, but let's take the example of this Saudi Arabia AF that we read. What is a way in which we could apply the first level of analysis to this Saudi-Yemen mess?
MBS thinks that the war paints him in a good light when the subjects of Saudi Arabia look at him because they see him as protecting their religion or Sunnis from Shias in Iran.
Yeah. Great, on-point answer. And I actually really like that you brought up that MBS does it to not like to sort of shore up support and to like gather popular support, because it's important to remember that, and this will be something that is relevant for some of the last school that we're going to analyze, that IR doesn't necessarily assume that states maximize interests. Like, there are plenty of quote-unquote irrational reasons that states do particular things. And so, and from the first level analysis, we can get a very intuitive idea when we're analyzing from specific leaders why and how like things happen when rationally they probably shouldn't. And the MBS example is pretty cool. So, all right. So the second level of analysis is the state or structural level. So if the first level analysis is purely from personalities and from specific individuals, the second level of analysis is from the perspective of how does the way in which governments are structured influence the international landscape. For example, I think some of you all have likely heard of democratic peace theory, which is the idea that in general, democracies do not go to war with each other. And this is an example of second level analysis because it's asking from the perspective of specific governments and types of governments. Why do wars happen or do not happen? And as you'll realize from the rest of this lecture, a lot of IR is just answering the question, why do wars happen or don't happen? Because that's the only thing IR scholars like studying. The third level of analysis, I'm going to quickly gloss over that one because I think it's one of the easier ones to understand. And I'm going to focus more on the third level, mostly because a lot of our theories are situated here, as well as it's kind of the hardest to understand. So the third level of analysis asks, how does the structure of the international system of states influence state behavior? And it's important to disaggregate this from how are states themselves structured, because that is, as I just explained, the second level of analysis. The third level of analysis asks, how does the overall, how does the environment in which states have to live in, how does that influence their decision making? For example, the easiest example to give, and which will provide a nice segue into the first school of thought, is the idea that the international system is an anarchy. And what this means is that there is no governing body within the international system that has the authority to sort of compel states to do things that they would not do. There is no single body that has power, what we would say power, to compel states to do certain things. What this means is that all states act in the international environment without any necessary rules, although that itself is something we'll dispute later. And they act out of their own interest. So,
quick question.
Yeah.
So things like the UN or Geneva Conventions, what level would that fall under? Because it seems to be something that regulates the international sphere, but is also a conglomeration of states.
Mm-hmm. So we would say that I think the way IR would answer that was to say that institutions like the UN or international law like the Geneva Conventions fall at the third level of analysis because they shape the environment in which states interact with each other. Because that's not the way in which any particular state is structured, and is obviously not how explaining motivations of any particular leaders. The example I just gave of the international system as anarchy is just one example of third level analysis, but not necessarily the only one. And I think that's a good point to bring up because it's sort of a lot of contest between different schools of thought, which I promise I'm about to introduce the first one, is based on sort of contesting the different assumptions between them. And so, for example, just to put the cart a little bit before the horse, realist scholars often assume that the international system is in total anarchy and that the only thing that matters is relative power. Whereas liberalists or liberals, not liberalists, as I learned on my IR midterm, would believe that even though the international system is generally of anarchy, it is possible for other international institutions and larger international agreements to mediate conflict independently, absent relative strength between states. Which that means they assume that things like the UN or international agreements have binding power and or not necessarily binding power, but do have some compelling power. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. All right. I've been hinting at introducing the three main schools of thought for a while now, so we are going to go to the first one. And there are a lot of subsets of different theories, especially for the first two I'm going to introduce, so I'm going to try to take them a little bit at a time. Just going at my pace. Okay, so key caveat that I'm going to bring up. IR is never fully encapsulated by any one particular school of thought, and most events usually benefit from analyzing from different perspectives. And if any of y'all, if this sounds really familiar, this is literally what the Bleecker 14 card we always read on K is about. The idea is that because these are different schools of thought, they all have implicit assumptions about how the world operates, and also about it also tend to sort of simplify reality in order to create a more parsimonious model of how international affairs works. And so as a result, there are always going to be things that, for example, any one school of IR thought cannot fully explain. But it is still helpful to reduce and simplify reality a little bit, if anything, just to be able to sort of better understand, or at least be able to at least have some approach to understanding international affairs. Okay, with that caveat aside, the first main school of thought is realism, which is something I was talking about with someone a little bit earlier. And there are going to be two main branches of realism. So the first main branch of realism is what we would call classical realism. This was originally developed, I think, in the 1940s possibly the 50s, by a scholar named Hans Morgenthau. Although a lot of the tenets of classical realism were sort of in the development for like a couple centuries, Machiavelli and Hobbes could be seen as like preludes to classical realist thought. So the first assumption that classical realism makes is that all humans are intrinsically violent and seek domination over other human beings. So right away, at what level of analysis can we see that classical realism is situated at? You have a 33% chance of getting it right.
I'm going to hazard a guess at first level.
It's a first level. You're right. It is situated at the first level analysis. I also think I pasted in first level of analysis on classical realism, so that was a bit of a dumb question to ask. But yeah, so the way classical realism would attempt to explain things is that states, and in particular the people who lead states, intrinsically seek domination over other human beings. And implicit within this sort of assumption is the sort of deeper assumption that both the international system and like society in general is one of anarchy. And so this is where you can sort of see like Hobbesian type thought coming through. You know, the whole idea of the state of nature and people seeking domination over others. A lot of that sort of thinking is implicit in classical realism. Yeah, so the main author, though, who sort of synthesizes this is, I mentioned earlier, Hans Morgenthau. And I forgot what the book he wrote was called. But he was the one who originally synthesized this. And it's probably like, this was probably the first truly like academic theory of IR, or at least one that resembles what modern IR looks like, which is why I'm starting with this one. Most IR scholars don't really work from classical realism anymore, mostly because a lot of people don't find it very persuasive as a way to explain international affairs, and a lot of people have contested the implicit assumption that human beings, are inherently dominant or like inherently seek domination over others and are in constant competition, and that necessarily influences the way the state makes decisions. But I did want to introduce this as sort of like mostly for academic reasons and making sure that you are aware of how this works, but also as a demonstration of what the three levels, as well as an application of like what the three levels of analysis were. So the other main branch of realist thought that I am going to talk about as soon as I can get this Google Doc to work is neorealism. And sorry I pasted kind of funky, but so neorealism was first developed by a man named Kenneth Waltz, who, fun fact, was my IR prof last semester, was one of his one of his graduate students. So he was the one who first came up with neorealism. And his main theory is situated at the third level of analysis. And what he says is that the international system is one of anarchy. The thing that states seek is not domination, but self-survival, which means that a state's actions will be guided by its desire to protect itself against external threats. And how that plays, and that will influence all the sort of decisions it makes, whether what alliances it chooses to make, when it goes to war, etc., etc. And so this is otherwise known as defensive realism. And the sort of unit of power that defensive realists, and really all realists, use is military strength. Which is just like, how effectively can you fight a war? Like, how many tanks do you have? How many troops can you field? How effective is your army in fighting? things like economic power, like the strength of your economy or other factors, only matter insofar as they somehow translate to overall military power. So already you can see like one of the assumptions that's being made here that that it can be implicitly challenged by other theories of thought. And the next theory that I'm going to introduce after realism would critique realism for its placing too much emphasis on overall military power in explaining international events. But for the sake of realist thought, the idea is that the metric of power is military power. How effectively can you fight a war? Yeah. So an important concept, and this is a little bit out of order on the outline, but an important concept in defensive realism is the security dilemma. The security dilemma, to give the dictionary definition of it, is a situation in which two states, the actions of two different states to secure themselves defensively, create an overall less secure environment. What would this look like? So to give an example, let's take the Cold War nuclear arms race. So you have two main superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union. And let's just assume that defensive realism is perfectly true, and that both the US and the Soviet Union act as defensive realists. If the US perceives the Soviet Union as a military threat to itself, it is the only other major power on the global stage that is capable of threatening the United States. So as a result, the United States perceives the need to build up its nuclear arsenal in order to deter and defend itself against the Soviet Union. So, and that seems logical, at least a little bit. The problem is, and this is the sort of key problem of the security dilemma, is that defensive buildups have or get misperceived by the other side as having offensive potential. So the Soviet Union will see the United States' nuclear buildup and perceive it as a threat to itself. And if you recall, if states are defensive realists and seek self-survival, then they will take actions to ensure that survival. So the Soviet Union, upon seeing the United States' buildup of its nuclear arsenal, decides that it should build up its own nuclear arsenal to maintain a sort of stable equilibrium of overall nuclear weapons with the United States. But the problem is that the United States sees the Soviets build up and feels like it needs to expand its arsenal even further in order to sort of deter the Soviet threat. And then you can very quickly see how this sort of cycle goes on. And this is how arms races happen. And this doesn't even have to be about nuclear weapons. A sort of related issue is the ballistic missile defense. The anti-ballistic missile treaty, which was it was signed at some point during the Cold War. And the ABM treaty was explicitly designed to prevent the development and maintenance of anti-ballistic weapons, which are just basically weapons to shoot down incoming missiles. And the idea was that, from the perspective of a defensive realist, anti-ballistic missiles allows you to shoot down another country's incoming nuclear weapons. So it's a defensive weapon. But the problem is that the ability to protect yourself from nuclear retaliation was seen as incredibly problematic because it would allow any country that had a sufficiently advanced anti-ballistic capability of just being able to launch nuclear weapons, or to be able to coerce other states without fear of nuclear retaliation. And so this is where sort of like more defensive realist thought comes in. So that is the security dilemma. And you can see this sort of example or sort of thought play out in a lot of international affairs. For example, like the AFRICOM AF that I wrote, a lot of the core African stability advantage was an issue of the security dilemma, where differently armed African states view each other as security threats. And as a result of the sort of complex interweb of relationships and the sort of imbalance of military power, could eventually lead itself to securitizing like maneuvers that eventually can culminate in a potential conflict. Okay, so that is a basic 101 to the security dilemma. Whenever you're reading an article that seems to have defensive realist like undertones, or if you're analyzing like any international affairs problem, just like thinking about the security dilemma is a very easy like rule of thumb that, when applied, usually like yields some kind of good insight and explains a lot of the ways in which like a lot of international IR scholars write when analyzing specific issues. Even if they don't call it the security dilemma by name, that sort of thinking is usually implicit in a lot of people. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about under defensive realism is balancing versus bandwagoning. So balancing versus bandwagoning is the question of what alliances form given defensive realism. So balancing, so under both of these, under balancing or bandwagoning, the situation is usually this. There is one state that is an overpowering hegemon. And there's another state, and there are another collection of states that are collectively powerful, but are all individually weaker than the sort of overriding hegemon. So balancing is the situation in which those weaker states band together in opposition to the hegemonic state. Bandwagoning is where weaker states sign onto an alliance with the hegemonic state. And so the way a defensive realist would explain this is that a state will balance or bandwagon depending on what it views as its key for its self-survival. So an advantage to bandwagoning, for example, would be that you have the protection of a much more powerful state. And if you are willing to cooperate with their interests, they are not likely to come after you, thereby ensuring your survival. However, the flip side of the problem with bandwagoning, of course, is that you are completely subject to the whims of the hegemon, and if they decide to turn against you, you're kind of out of luck. Likewise with balancing, if a collection of states can come together, then they can all collectively secure each other and increase their overall power to potentially be stronger than that of the hegemon, thereby like ensuring their survival. But also on the flip side, if the alliance is not sufficiently strong, then it is possible for the hegemon to be sort of incensed or incentivized to go after the alliance to break it up, and thereby sort of providing a negative contribution to overall self-survival. And then you can probably see examples of this in history. The easy example that comes to mind is NATO as a form of balancing against the Soviet Union, which was the sort of predominant, at the time, possibly dominant hegemon in Europe. Okay, any questions about defensive realism before I move on? If no one says anything, I'll just move on. Okay, so the other flavor of neo-realism is offensive realism. So we had defensive realism, and now there's offensive realism. And I just realized this might be a little bit confusing, so I'll clarify the organization. At the top level, there's just overall realism, which is just focused on military power overall and is generally about either domination or self-survival given international anarchy. Under realism, there is classical realism and neo-realism. Under neo-realism, there's two types of realism under there, defensive realism and offensive realism. So just to clarify in case you're a little bit confused. So offensive realism is not necessarily about states, the self-survival of states, but the idea that states are inherently expansionist and use offensive capabilities to secure continued survival. This is mostly forwarded by a scholar, I believe he's at U Chicago, named John Mearsheimer. And I think he's the one that people carded for the realism framework of like years ago, or at least that's the way Bob was explaining it. And And generally, the focus of offensive realism is on the ways in which great powers interact with each other, and specifically how they influence the international landscape to slowly control, take more power for themselves. And in a way, this is supposed to be a form of self-survival, a way in which they not necessarily secure themselves, but expand their power and overall hegemony in order to best ensure their survival. Yeah. I would say that there are probably fewer offensive realist scholars than defensive realists. I got the impression that John Mearsheimer is like mainly the one that really pushes offensive realism. Although there are strains of sort of that kind of sort of thinking about domination and the way in which that potentially influences potential wars. For example, I had like a classmate last semester who wrote a paper about how, if any of y'all know what happened in the 6 Days War, explaining the 6 Days War from an offensive realist perspective, and how Israel like sought inherent expansion in the Middle East to better secure its stakeholder power. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's sort of the basic argument. Okay, so a question in the outline is, what is a great power? I guess an easier way to approach this question is, can anyone give examples? Can one of you three give an example of what you think a great power is? There should be like two immediate obvious ones.
The U.S. and China.
Yeah, so the U.S. and China, I would probably still throw in Russia for the time being, and possibly the European Union. So those are examples, and like intuitively from what you all have read of literature makes sense as what great powers are. But what defines a great power? It's a little bit fuzzy, and there's not a very clear bright line, but the general guideline is that a great power is a country that wields significant influence on the world stage. What this means is that they can influence events on a global scale through either military power, generally through military power, but although other forms of influence such as soft power, which I think you all have heard of, can be a factor in sort of great power politics. This is in contrast to, so if a great power is a country that has enough military power and influence to be able to influence all events on a world stage, then a middling power would be a country that has the capability to influence events. It just cannot do so as effectively as global a scale as a great power, does it have the same degree of power. So, for example, and a sort of subset of middling powers are regional powers, which can significantly influence events, but only in their geographical area. Hello to whoever just joined. So a regional power, and one that's very pertinent to our topic, would be Saudi Arabia and Iran. Neither of them can greatly influence events on a global stage. They obviously do have some influence. They do have some influence, obviously, and can create some significant change on the global level, but nowhere obviously to the same effect as a country like the US or China. But they do exercise significant influence in their particular corner of the globe, which is what makes them what we call regional powers. And something I should have said like 2 minutes ago, but I just forgot because derp, is that what the definition of power is. If you take any sort of government, international relations, sociology, like whatever class in college, and you might even hear this in high school, what the classical definition of power is a situation in which we would say A has power if A can get B to do something that B would not otherwise do. This is I forgot who exactly came up with this, but this is the classic definition of power, and You will hear it a lot if you do anything government or international affairs related in college. And so a great power we would define as a country that has the power to get other countries on a global scale to do things they would otherwise not do. The US, for example, we would call a great power because it can use its military influence or other influence to get other countries to do actions that they may not do, either through compellence or persuasion. Okay. Any questions about any of the realist thought that we have just gone over before I move on to liberalism? Okay. So liberalism, if my computer can catch up, also has a classical and a neo version of it. The classical liberal version was espoused by our good friend Immanuel Kant. And I promise it will be in the doc in a second. My computer is being very slow. So the main postulate of classical liberalism centers around, nope, that's offensive realism still, centers around the idea of the democratic peace theory, which you heard me talking about earlier. And we know that to be situated at the second level of analysis, which is the analysis from the level of the state. Please work. There we go. So the basic tenet of democracy, of democratic peace theory, is that democracies do not go to war with each other. And this was sort of like the main part of Immanuel Kant's, like the part that Immanuel Kant did, right, about international affairs. This is what he was mainly focused on. Why would democracies not go to war with each other? Well, there are a litany of reasons. For example, war in general tends to be incredibly destructive, and it is hard for an elected leader to perhaps justify the cost to other democracies. Democracies also, in general, share common beliefs, and as a result, are less likely to have ideological conflicts with each other. Democracies also, the general principle of a democracy where the general people have to elect a common leader and to represent their interests, as well as the ideas of policy decisions should be made not by force but by sort of like civic participation. All of these sort of traits in general tend to make democracies more peaceful than non-democratic forms of government. And generally in history, this seems to be generally true. While democracies do often go to war with non-democracies, democracies rarely go to war with each other. And of course, like, there are some like criticisms of this as just merely correlation without causation, and also the fact that this sort of belies the nuanced differences between various forms of democracies. For example, if it's like a hybrid regime versus like a democracy, how likely are they go to war with each other? Those are like some criticisms of democratic peace theory, but what I just said about how democracies in principle should not be going to war with each other seems to be, for the large part, empirically true. Once again, this is sort of the less like classical realism. Classical liberalism is, aside from the democratic peace theory, is not really one that is talked about that much in international politics anymore. The main focus is on what we would call neoliberalism, which I hopefully have just successfully pasted it. My apologies, y'all. My computer is being really slow because it's running a million different things at once. But the other form of liberalism is what we would call neoliberalism. And no, this is not neoliberalism like the K. This is different, just like a whole different register of neoliberalism. So at least the ones I read, the pieces I read for neoliberalism in my IR class were by two scholars named Robert Cohane and Joseph Nye. Joseph Nye is the one who like came up with the idea of soft power. Robert Cohen, I think, is an IR prof at Harvard, although someone should double check me on that. So the idea of neoliberalism, like neorealism, is situated at the third level of analysis, and that it's about the structure of the international landscape, and how that influences how people interact, how states interact. The first main concept is about sensitivity / interdependence. The idea of interdependence is mutual reliance on a partner country to produce or do something. And that's incredibly vague, and it's sort of very broad, and it's sort of meant to be. The idea is that if you have a relationship with another country, there is something you are currently doing or producing that if you do not have a good relationship with that country, you are incapable of producing that. So, for example, before World War II, Japan had no domestic access to oil, but it was at the time a industrialized country that was considered a relative great power on the international landscape, and therefore had a pretty huge army and navy to fuel. And it was entirely reliant on U.S. oil exports in order to be able to keep its economy going. That is an example of what we would call interdependence, where one country is just totally reliant on another country in order to do X. And as a result, we can see the idea of interdependence is that interdependence should create peace, because if you are reliant on another country to give you something, you will not go to war with them, otherwise you will lose access to the thing that you so desperately need. And the example I just brought up about Japan sort of bears this out. Japan only declares war with the United States after the U.S. imposes an oil embargo on Japan. And this is the argument you will see a lot of scholars talk about when it comes to things like international trade, in that from their perspective, the thing that deters war is not military power, but rather the sort of economic relationship between countries. Which is why a lot of scholars are super concerned about the trade war the United States is starting, because they're afraid that this will break down overall interdependence between different countries and could potentially incentivize some kind of conflict, if not military, between different countries. Within interdependence, there is something called asymmetric interdependence, where two countries can be interdependent on one another, but one country is less interdependent. So an example is Russia with the European Union. The European Union gets a lot of its electricity from Russian natural gas and oil exports. And it is basically impossible to keep the lights on in Europe without Russian energy exports. That's slowly changing, but that's still the situation now. Russia is somewhat reliant on Western capital for its economy, to develop its economy. And so in 2013 or 14, I can't quite remember when this happened, when Russia invaded Crimea for the first time, you saw an example of asymmetric interdependence, where there were Western sanctions imposed on Russia, and the Russian economy did suffer a little bit as a result of those sanctions. But the European Union in general was very incapacitated to make a response, because they knew that if they made too strong of a response to the Russian invasion, that Russia could just cut off their oil and basically shut down all of their economies and electricity grids, simply because they were that reliant on Russian gas exports. Okay, so the other concept within interdependence is something called sensitivity. This is distinct from interdependence in that basically it would really hurt for you to harm relations with another country, but you wouldn't be absolutely screwed. For example, the U.S.-China trade war right now is what I would consider an example of sensitivity. It probably is overall, it's net less economic efficient for the U.S. to be in a trade war with China and vice versa. But it's not like the U.S. and China would not be able to produce or manufacture the goods that the other country is producing, even if all trade relations were to stop. It would be less economically efficient overall, and it would lead to higher prices for everything. But it's not a situation like Japan's dependence on U.S. oil, where the U.S. just absolutely would not be able to produce anything if China were to cease trade relationships with us. Yeah, so that's the first example. That's the first main concept of sensitivity interdependence. And here you see the sort of metric for neoliberalism is not military power, but rather economic power. And sort of how economic power was sort of folded into military power in neorealism, military power is in a way folded into economic power when it comes to neoliberalism, but it just plays a lot less of an influence than overall economic relationships and interdependence plays in neoliberalism. Okay. The other main aspect, and I'm already realizing I bit off more than I could chew, even with just these three theories. But we're coming to the third theory. The second main part of neoliberalism is is the issue of international cooperation. So if we recall earlier, there is an assumption within the international system of anarchy, that all states act independently of each other without a sort of overall world governing body to force people to make certain decisions. So a neo-realist answer to this dilemma was just to say, well, screw it. We just have to have like the best military around, and that will be sufficient to deter threats. The way a neoliberal tries to approach the problem of anarchy is to try to resolve the problem of international cooperation. How can you ensure durable international cooperation in which one country does not get cheated? And this gets into a lot of game theory, not the YouTube channel, but the idea of how do specific players in a game, how will they play that game? And how can we anticipate them to play that game? There are three main types of games that neoliberals analyze. I'm not going to go super in-depth on all of them, but they're called the prisoner's dilemma, the stag hunt, and the game of chicken. Prisoner's dilemma is probably the one y'all have heard of. It's basically where, to give an example, if two co-conspirators are arrested and interrogated separately, both know that if neither of them confesses to doing a crime, they will both only get 3 years in jail. If one of them confesses, the one that confesses will go off completely free, and the other one will get 10 years in jail. But if both of them confess and rat the other one out, then they both get 5 years in jail. So we can see that the best situation for cooperation that results in the best result is for neither of them to say anything, and they both only get 3 years in jail. The problem is, though, is that since both of these prisoners are being interrogated separately, they're each incentivized to rat on the other and hopefully get off scot-free while the other one gets 10 years in jail. But because both end up doing that, they both end up with 5 years in jail, which is worse than the 3 years in jail that they would have had if they had both just kept silent. This is like a really classical problem, and this sort of like thinking shows up a lot. A similar situation plays out with two countries involving an international agreement. And to give a specific example that's been in the news recently is the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF Treaty, from 1987. This was a treaty between the United States and the then Soviet Union. And then after the Soviet Union dissolved, it was between the United States and Russia. This is a really good example for the prisoner's dilemma because it's a bilateral treaty and it's pretty straightforward in what it does. And it's clear as to what the benefits for unilateral defection, and defection, as I'll refer to it from now on, just means that like you break the promise. Between unilateral and both sides defecting, what the benefits and costs to each country end up being. So, in short, the INF Treaty says that neither the United States nor Russia can develop a certain class of missiles. And I forget the exact missile range, but it's like there's a very specific range that was banned. So you could only have missiles that were below or above this range. and the treaty just explicitly banned all of them. And there were like provisions for like inspecting the other country's nuclear silos and such. So the mutual benefit, if both the United States and Russia comply to the treaty in good faith, is that there is an overall less dangerous security environment, because both countries will not have what is considered to be a very dangerous, strategically dangerous missile to have. But if one country defects, let's say Russia defects because they are the one who actually broke the INF treaty first. If Russia unilaterally develops an intermediate range missile, it has a pretty significant strategic advantage over the U.S. because it can station those missiles in strategic hotspots in a way that the United States cannot counter because it does not have intermediate range missiles of its own. So Russia gains a very large, independent, unilateral strategic benefit from breaking the treaty on its own at a significant cost to the United States. Likewise, flip the situation if the United States unilaterally defects. However, if both sides develop intermediate range missiles, then we just have the more dangerous status quo we had before the treaty came into place. And in a situation in which both sides have intermediate range missiles is still more dangerous than one in which neither of them has intermediate range missiles. And you can already see the prisoner's dilemma style thing play out here. And this is more or less what's happening in the news right now. Russia has basically been in violation of the INF treaty for like a decade now, and the United States is now pulling out. And so now we're reverting to that situation where both sides are defecting as a result of independent incentives, strategic incentives. The other two types of games I'll just go over real quickly, and I don't really have time to give specific examples or long-winded examples as I just did. But the stag hunt is basically where you have a group of people hunting a stag, which is like the big prize. You all need to collectively work together to get the stag, but you as an independent hunter can defect from the group and secure an individual smaller prize for yourself, i.e. the rabbit. But if you do defect and only get the rabbit, then none of the group gets the stag. And then the game of chicken is one in which the usual example is given is that two people are in race cars and are hurtling at each other and will crash. But the goal is to get the other one to swerve out of the way first, because it's supposed to be like an ego contest. And if neither of you acts to divert, then you will crash and result in a net worse situation. But you don't want to be the one that swerves first. Those are the types of games that are usually analyzed from a neoliberal perspective. Whereas earlier, as I said, the neo-realist situation to this dilemma is solely focused on military power, the neoliberal solution is to have international organizations, such as, for example, the United Nations, that can ensure the best outcome. Because one of the tenets of game theory is that the way to resolve issues like the prisoner's dilemma is to sort of introduce a third party who can impose a cost on defection that makes it undesirable to defect. And it's a little bit hard to give a real-world example because the UN is in many ways a little bit toothless. But theoretically, if there was another governing body who could impose significant costs on the United States or Russia for unilaterally defecting from the INF treaty, such that it makes it undesirable, even with the additional strategic incentive to develop gathered from intermediate range missiles, it would ensure compliance with the treaty, because it is now in the country's best interest to comply with the treaty instead of defecting. And the reason neoliberals view international organizations as being key is because they are the ones that can provide a sort of arbitration mechanism for international agreements. This is why you also have, like, in a lot of treaties involving weapons of mass destruction, you have independent agencies and structures, international agencies and structures set up in order to enforce them, in order to discourage unilateral defection. Okay, I don't have this in the outline, I think, but another thing that game theory suggests to us from an international agreement perspective is the idea that the idea that having when seeking a larger goal, having multiple intermediary steps to that larger goal is a better mechanism for enforcement than one in which there's just over a larger goal. This is why international treaties, for example, like the Iran nuclear deal, have so many different like certification steps embedded in them, because they are designed to be they're designed to ensure continual compliance, and that over time a country is not incentivized to defect. And where this is situated in game theory is the idea that whereas if there's only one round of a game, defection is more likely. But if there are multiple iterative, or just like for example 10 rounds of the game, defection is less likely. To explain that in the terms of the prisoner's dilemma, if we return to the example of the two prisoners from before, if they only did one heist together and they end up in this situation, defection is more likely because there's not a potential for a future relationship that it would inform their future interactions. But if both of them know that they have to work together in the future, and they know that this exact same situation where they get caught again and interrogated again might happen again, both of them are less incentivized to defect, because they know that if they unilaterally defect, even though they get an initial short-term benefit, the long-term benefit from broken trust means that in the long run, their overall net utility is lower. And likewise, that logic applies to certification in treaties. If one party defects now, they get a short-term benefit, but it means in the long run, the partner country is less likely to trust them, and that means they can't keep getting the same short-term benefit. Okay, that's it for neoliberalism and overall international interdependence. Any questions about neoliberalism before I get into the last main school of IR thought? Okay, cool. Last one. Please paste correctly. Cool. Yeah. So the last school of thought is constructivism. And constructivism is the one that is probably the most dramatically different from the different schools of thought, in that whereas both neorealism and neoliberalism both share an implicit assumption in that states are rational actors who seek to maximize their self-interest, whatever that self-interest is defined, whether it's self-security or overall economic welfare. They do whatever it is to maximize whatever they care about the most. Constructivism says that states aren't necessarily rational. They are what we are. They are, and IR itself is not necessarily material, as defined by military strength or economic strength, but is instead ideational and is instead defined by norms and ideas that are perpetuated in the international landscape. And as a result, states don't necessarily act rationally, but instead act in accordance with norms, or act in ways that they perceive norms are changing. And you can already see where this is somewhat true, in that states all the time do not act in what we would perceive as in their best interest. This is sort of maybe not the best example, but it's one that I remember from earlier, is that Tej brought up the issue with the Saudi intervention in Yemen. There's a pretty good account that the Saudi intervention in Yemen is pretty bad for the Saudi regime. Like, it costs them a lot of money. It's making them look really bad on an international landscape. Yet they're in Yemen anyway. And there is a case to be made that is not really necessary for their overall security. So it's a question of, so then I guess, why is Saudi Arabia in Yemen? And maybe one way to explain that is from a sort of constructivist perspective, which is to say that Saudi Arabia has this idea that they need to counter Iranian influence because of Iran's dominance as a Shia power and Saudi Arabia's status as a Sunni power. And Saudi Arabia, from that perspective, feels the need to counter overall rising Iranian influence. So I mentioned earlier that constructivism says that state behavior is in accordance with a norm. Norms, like a lot of things in IR, is a little bit vague, but in general, a norm is just a collection of shared beliefs that we all sort of just buy into, and that we sort of, even if they don't necessarily reflect material reality, we often act as if though it did. The historical examples of this include the nuclear taboo, which if for those of you who don't know what that is, the nuclear taboo is just the idea that states should not be using nuclear weapons in conflicts, that they are so destructive as to warrant their perpetual non-use. And if, we have all grown up in a world in which nuclear weapons have never been used in an actual conflict. And I think we all generally share the idea that nuclear weapons hopefully should never be used in a potential conflict. And this is a bit of an odd idea in that this is possibly like one of the few times in world history where certain weapons were deemed to be just too dangerous or not okay to use. The same goes for like chemical and biological weapons. And there's like no like real reason why you can't. Well, I mean, there are reasons why nuclear weapons should not be used and that they're incredibly destructive. But from like a military strategic perspective, and from like a perspective of someone like leading a country, there is no overall compelling reason that, for example, tactical nuclear weapons should not be used in a battlefield context. Yet there is still an overarching moral force against the use of nuclear weapons, and that is best explained not necessarily by overall nuclear deterrence, but instead by just this sort of norm that all countries in the world share right now that says that no one should be using nuclear weapons. And you have a lot of people, and to take the nuclear taboo example a little bit further, because this is all I read about nowadays, the nuclear taboo is also a good example of the way in which norms could potentially change and erode. A lot of IR scholars, for example, are concerned by the ways in which India and Pakistan are making changes to their nuclear arsenal that potentially favor the first strikes involving nuclear weapons. And they are worried that if countries increasingly shift to more aggressive postures with their nuclear weapons, that could eliminate the nuclear taboo, remove the idea that nuclear weapons should not be used. And this sort of demonstrates what it means for IR to be ideational, in that the way in which ideas and norms develop is not a function of necessarily what material facts are on the ground, but just how do people think about specific things and what are they willing to believe. I think this next example is one in which is another example, a good example of how ideas have developed historically, which is the idea that civilians should not be harmed in wartime. So, for example, during World Wars, less so during World War I, but definitely during World War II, there were a lot of civilian casualties. This was the idea of total war. Basically, like, it was considered okay to bomb civilians as a means of warfare. This was like the Blitz in London. This was the fire bombings in Tokyo. And after World War II, the norm started developing that military conflicts should be constrained to conflicts between opposing armed forces and should not involve civilians. Obviously, you see this norm being violated now, a la our Saudi AF. But the thing is now that there is much more international condemnation of that than there used to be in the past. In the past, for example, during World War II, bombing civilian centers was not just considered acceptable, but was considered like a strategic part of war. And now you see like sort of the international backlash against Saudi Arabia for its bombing of civilians. And you can see sort of how that mindset toward civilians has changed. Some other examples I think I put in here. For example, the first thing I started this lecture with is the idea of the Westphalian state. Like, traditionally, it's in the norm that the only international actors that matter on the world stage are states, like traditional states, like the United States, Russia, China, whatever. It's increasingly becoming the case that non-state actors matter oftentimes just as much as traditional states do. Non-governmental organizations, whatever form they take, international institutions like the United Nations, terrorist groups, multinational corporations, these all increasingly matter in sort of these are all institutions that have increasingly mattered more over the last few decades, and so once again sort of challenge the norm that the way in which IR has to be conducted is from the perspective of the traditional Westphalian state, because it's starting to increasingly become the case that is not necessarily the way in which IR should be approached. You know what? I'm not going to go over this last part about non-state actors / NGOs because that, I think, deserves a more thorough breakdown. And if people really want to know more about this, I can go over that in part 2. But okay, this, I think, is more or less the conclusion. I think I've been talking at the very least for like over an hour now, which is already over what I wanted this to be. Okay, so I have just like smushed what I think is like a third or a half of a semester of a traditional IR class into like 1 hour. So I understand. So I apologize for any sort of brevity or situations in which I was maybe and probably going a little bit too fast on certain concepts. Do any of the 4 of you on this call right now have any particular questions about anything that was just discussed in the last hour?
No, not really.
Okay. All right. Cool. I thought I heard someone say something besides Ishan. Okay, maybe I was just wrong. Okay. Cool. All right. This is all I've got for what I'm considering part 1. This is meant to be an introduction. Hope at least it was at least somewhat helpful. The way in which I think this will be immediately useful is not necessarily for winning any particular debate round, but instead for giving you a more systematic approach to reading IR literature. So when you're reading an article, you should think about like, is this from a realist perspective? Is this from a liberal perspective? Are they making an argument of interdependence that likely falls under neoliberalism, et cetera, et cetera? And if you see people making critiques of other IR scholars, it's helpful to think about, well, what perspective are they starting from and what perspective is the other author starting from? And then you can see how their arguments often develop along the lines of clashes between different schools. Okay, real quick before we end this. So for part 2, my hope was to, if this was supposed to be like traditional, like top-down IR theory, for part 2, like specific issues that people want to discuss that are relevant to IR but are more specific and are like applications of, for example, the 3 schools I just talked about. And just like for an hour, maybe go through like 3, 4, maybe 5 different issues. So my current short list, and I will like eliminate to the ones that I think that people and I think are most relevant. But right now what I have involves civil wars, weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, FemIR, which I'm probably not going to do just because I don't think I'm a very good I'm not like a great expert in that field. The historical rise of China, and international law. And I think someone at one point asked for Russia. And I know someone else requested the history of U.S. hedge. Are there any other particular topics people are interested in? Okay, I'll take that as a no, and I can also send out a poll later. So for people watching this as a video, message me if you have anything you want. And for the four of you, just like reach me over Slack if you have like any questions about anything I just talked about, or if you like look back at your notes and have like confusions about what I just said. Cool.
For your